The storm came like a monster in the night. Windows shattered, roofs lifted, and entire streets disappeared beneath roaring waves of water and splintered wood. Families huddled together, praying their walls could withstand nature's fury. It was the kind of hurricane that left scars not only on buildings, but on hearts. And when the morning sun finally rose, the devastation looked endless. Homes that once stood proud were reduced to piles of debris. The neighborhood where laughter and children's voices once echoed was now a graveyard of broken dreams. But amid the wreckage, one house stood firm. It wasn't untouched. The shutters hung loose, the yard was littered with branches, and the paint bore the marks of flying debris. Yet the foundation was solid, the roof intact, the walls strong. The man who lived there, Darnell Johnson, a quiet black homeowner who had worked tirelessly to maintain his property, could only stare in stunned relief. His home had survived when nearly every other one had not. He thanked God, not once thinking that his survival would soon be twisted into something sinister. Neighbors walked past in disbelief. Some murmured that he must have known something they didn't. Others muttered under their breath, their tone edged with something sharper than confusion: envy. It didn't take long for rumors to spread. They whispered that his house couldn't possibly have withstood the storm naturally, that maybe, somehow, Darnell had altered the winds or interfered with the storm itself. What started as a murmur quickly evolved into a narrative. If everyone else's home was destroyed and his survived, then surely he must have caused it. At first, Darnell brushed it off. People were emotional, grieving their losses, looking for explanations where none existed. But then came the letter. Stamped with the emblem of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, the letter accused him in cold, formal words. By surviving the hurricane while the majority of neighborhood properties were destroyed, you have caused undue distress, financial harm, and community imbalance. You are hereby held liable for damages in the amount of $10,000. Darnell read the words again and again, his hands shaking. $10 million? For surviving? It felt surreal, like a cruel joke. But the HOA was serious. They claimed his house's survival had destabilized property values, and that his selective protection had altered the natural course of destruction. Beneath the jargon was a truth Darnell couldn't ignore. This wasn't about storms or houses. This was about him, about being a black man who dared to stand strong when everything else had fallen. The weight of centuries pressed on his chest as he thought about it. How often had black resilience been met with suspicion rather than admiration? How often had black survival been painted as defiance, black strength twisted into threat? Here it was again, in plain words on official paper. They didn't see his relief as human. They saw it as something unnatural. They didn't see his survival as luck or preparation. They saw it as offense. The lawsuit spread like wildfire through the media. Headlines screamed, HOA sues homeowner for surviving hurricane. News stations replayed footage of his sturdy house standing amid the rubble, turning his private struggle into national spectacle. Some commentators mocked the absurdity, calling it a parody of justice. But others, some neighbors, some officials, leaned into the darker narrative. How come his house made it when the rest didn't? They asked. What was he doing that the rest of us weren't? Darnell couldn't sleep at night. The sound of the storm replayed in his mind, but louder now were the accusations, the looks, the unspoken words. He remembered the months of work he'd put into reinforcing his home, saving paycheck after paycheck to afford stronger beams, sealing the foundation, trimming every tree that might fall. He remembered the weekends spent on ladders, sweating under the sun while others laughed and said he was wasting his time. That was the truth. But truth didn't matter when prejudice found a stage. His friends told him to fight. His mother, her voice steady even after decades of seeing the world's cruelty, told him, "Baby, they've always tried to make our survival look like a crime. Don't let them take your peace. Don't let them take your story." So he decided to speak out. Standing in front of reporters, cameras flashing, he wore his pain, but also his pride. "I did nothing wrong," he said firmly. "I worked for this house. I protected this house. I prayed over this house. And now, because it survived, I'm being treated like a criminal. Do you hear how ridiculous that is? I will not apologize for surviving. I will not pay $10 million for existing." His words struck a chord across the country. Messages poured in. People who had faced discrimination in their own neighborhoods, families who knew the sting of being punished for simply enduring. The absurdity of the HOA's lawsuit became a symbol of something bigger, how black strength, instead of being celebrated, was often vilified. But the HOA doubled down. They brought in lawyers, filing official motions. They claimed his house had redirected wind currents and increased the destructive force on adjacent properties. They even hired so-called experts to argue that his roof's shape had made neighboring houses more vulnerable. It was science twisted into theater, logic bent to prejudice. And beneath it all lay a truth the legal papers never said out loud. They couldn't accept that a black man had built something that stood when theirs had fallen. The trial loomed. Darnell sat with his attorney, overwhelmed by the mountain he faced. $10 million wasn't just a number, it was his life, his future, his family's security. He thought about his father, who had marched for civil rights, who had told him that every generation would face its own version of the fight. Maybe this is mine, Darnell thought quietly. In the courtroom, eyes followed him like he was already guilty. The HOA lawyers painted him as suspicious, as someone who had benefited unfairly from tragedy. They used words like community destabilization and unnatural survival. To Darnell, it was chilling. Wasn't this the same old story retold in a new way? The accusation that his success, his survival, his very being was somehow a threat to others? Yet when he took the stand, something shifted. His voice didn't tremble. He spoke of the nights he spent reinforcing his home, the sacrifices he made, the dignity he carried in maintaining it. He spoke not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told that their resilience was unacceptable. "If my survival is a crime," he said, looking straight into the eyes of his accusers, "then this country has a much bigger storm to answer for." The courtroom went silent. For the first time, the weight of his words fell heavier than the storm outside had ever been. The silence in that courtroom lingered. For a moment, it felt as if the very air had stilled, like the world itself was listening. Darnell's words had cut through the noise of accusations, the legal jargon, the twisted logic. Yet he knew one speech would not be enough to turn the tide. The HOA's lawyers were relentless. They painted charts, brought diagrams, wheeled in so-called meteorological experts who pointed at models and claimed his roof had redirected winds into a funnel effect that worsened destruction elsewhere. It was theater disguised as science, prejudice dressed as professionalism, but the jury wasn't blind. They could see the absurdity, even if some didn't want to admit it out loud. As witnesses testified, cracks began to appear in the HOA's story. A local contractor called as a witness revealed that Darnell had spent months strengthening his home. Receipts of reinforced steel beams, invoices for storm shutters, bank records showing sacrifice after sacrifice, all painted a picture not of manipulation, but of preparation. Still, Darnell could feel the unspoken tension. The case was no longer just about property. It was about identity. When his lawyer objected to a statement from the HOA counsel suggesting that Darnell's methods of survival were not normal in this neighborhood, Darnell caught the glance of one juror, eyes narrowed, silently echoing centuries of suspicion. Not normal for who? Outside the courthouse, protesters began to gather. Some carried signs that read, "Survival is not a crime." Others raised placards that said, "We stand with Darnell." Civil rights organizations weighed in, declaring the lawsuit a grotesque example of racialized scapegoating. Social media lit up with outrage. Clips of Darnell's testimony went viral. His words quoted like a rallying cry. "If my survival is a crime, then this country has a much bigger storm to answer for." The HOA, realizing they were losing control of the narrative, doubled their efforts. They pushed harder, demanding the full $10 million. But the more aggressive they became, the more absurd their stance appeared. Neighbors who had once murmured against Darnell now hesitated, realizing that siding with the HOA meant standing against common sense and justice. Some even came forward, ashamed, admitting on the stand that they had mocked his dedication when he was preparing his home. never believing it would pay off. Through it all, Darnell held himself with a quiet dignity. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't let them drag him into anger. He thought of his father's words, of his mother's strength, of the countless unnamed who had stood firm through storms of another kind, storms of discrimination, exclusion, hatred. This trial was bigger than him. It was about showing that black resilience could not be twisted into guilt. After weeks of hearings, the closing arguments arrived. The HOA's attorney thundered about unfair advantage and community damage. They spoke as though survival itself was selfish. But Darnell's lawyer, a young black woman with fire in her voice, rose and dismantled their case piece by piece. She showed the receipts, the records, the photographs of Darnell working on his roof long before the storm. She asked the jury, "Since when is being prepared a crime? Since when is surviving a storm worthy of $10 million in punishment?" You know the answer. This is not about property. This is about punishing a man for standing tall when others wanted him on his knees. Her words echoed through the courtroom, and for the first time, Darnell felt hope heavy in his chest, pressing against his ribs like it wanted to burst free. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched like days. Darnell sat in the hall, hands folded, whispering prayers. He wasn't praying for victory alone. He was praying for truth, for a world where survival would no longer be met with suspicion. When the doors finally opened and the foreman stood, Darnell held his breath. The verdict was unanimous. Not liable, Darnell's knees nearly gave out. The words rang in his ears like a bell of freedom. The HOA's case had been dismissed, their accusations reduced to dust like the debris of the storm. But even in victory, he knew this was more than just a personal win. It was a statement, a precedent, a beacon for anyone who had ever been told that their resilience was a problem, that their survival was somehow too much. Reporters swarmed him outside. Microphones pressed close, cameras flashing. Darnell raised his head, his voice steady. "They tried to turn my survival into a crime. They tried to make me pay for standing strong. But today, the truth stood taller. And I want everyone listening to know, never apologize for surviving. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for standing when others fall. Our survival is not a threat. It's our right!" The crowd erupted, cheers blending with tears. Strangers hugged him. Children waved signs with his name. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of his ancestors, their voices whispering, "Well done. Keep standing." In the months that followed, Darnell's story became more than news. It became a movement. Community groups invited him to speak about resilience, preparation, and dignity. Universities asked him to share his testimony. His words were studied in classrooms. His trial cited in legal discussions about discrimination and equity. His house, once just a home, became a symbol, a reminder that strength should never be seen as guilt, that survival is not a privilege, but a right. The HOA, humiliated and exposed, quietly disbanded. Their attempt to scapegoat him had backfired spectacularly, but Darnell carried no malice. When asked if he felt vengeance, he shook his head. "Storms reveal truth," he said. "The hurricanes showed which houses were strong. This lawsuit showed which hearts were weak. I don't need vengeance. I have peace." And in the quiet of his home, as he sat on the same porch where he had once watched the winds rage, he looked out at the world with calm eyes. The walls around him, the roof above him, the ground beneath him, all stood firm. But stronger still was the truth within him, that his survival, his dignity, his strength could never again be made into a crime. Because in the end, storms do not only test houses. They test people. They test justice. They test the courage of a man who refuses to bow. And Darnell Johnson, black, proud, unbroken, had passed the test with a victory no hurricane, no lawsuit, no prejudice could ever erase.